Hello everyone, this is Jennifer Palmer from the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. The ACMHE is a multidisciplinary academic association with a membership of over 500 educators, administrators, staff, students, researchers, and other professionals committed to the transformation of higher education through the development of the contemplative dimensions of teaching, learning, and knowing. The ACMHE is an initiative of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. I'd like to welcome you to our June webinar, Towards an Embodied Social Justice, Integrating Mindfulness into an Anti-Oppression Pedagogy. Beth Barilla is the director of the Women's Studies program and a professor in the Ethnic and Women's Studies department at St. Cloud State University. Her work addresses intersections of embodiment, feminism, yoga, and mindful education. Her current writings focus on how college students can learn to use contemplative practices to live healthier, more balanced lives, and how teachers can effectively integrate contemplative practices to help students unlearn the effects of systems of oppression. I'd now like to welcome Beth Barilla.
Thank you so much for joining me in today's webinar. I'm super excited to continue this conversation that I think is just so important. I also really want to thank the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society for all the fabulous work they've done over the past several years. I don't know if some of you felt this, but I kind of felt alone for a while doing some of this mindfulness work and seeing some of the connections between yoga and what I was teaching and some of the ways in which yoga and meditation could really enhance the feminist work that I was teaching in the classroom. But for a while, I felt like it was an uphill battle to get people to sort of understand that this link was viable. And so I was so thrilled to find the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society and all their valuable webinars and the conversations that they host. They've really, I think, furthered this work in a lot of great ways. Speaking of conversations, I really just want to invite you to stay in touch through my email account that's up there, or there's a Facebook link off my website. You can also email me through St. Cloud State. This, I think, is a really, really rich conversation that is launching and burgeoning in a lot of valuable ways, and I'd really like to stay in touch with some of y'all who are interested in this work, because I think it has a lot of important places to go in the near future. So I just want to start by prefacing my assumptions about who's joining us today. I'm assuming that people are coming into this conversation from a lot of different places. I'm assuming that some of us are experienced with contemplative practices and are maybe curious about how to use them in diversity classes. Others of us might be experienced with diversity classes but are unfamiliar with what contemplative practices are or what they might bring to those classrooms, while still others might be unfamiliar to both and just kind of curious. So I'm really going to do my best in the short 45 minutes that we have to create a point of entry for all of us, knowing that I think this is just a piece in a much larger conversation. So here's my plan for today's webinar. The first part of the webinar is going to be how and why we would use contemplative practices, specifically in anti-oppression classrooms. I'll lay out some of the reasoning for why it's such a valuable link. And then we'll do a short practice. And then I want to segue into what might emerge when we do use these practices in the classroom, in any classroom, whether it's an anti-oppression classroom or a classroom that doesn't deal with any social justice issues. If we bring contemplative practices into the classroom, given the complex lives our students have, some issues might come up that as professors we may or may not be aware of. And then I want to offer some tips for handling those situations as they arise. All right, well, this is part of a larger project I'm working on embodied social justice that I'd be happy to talk with at a further time. But let's move on to my definitions. And really, I'm just going to give really quick definitions because we could spend a lot of time talking about these terms, and I really just want to get us on some kind of the same page, since I assume we're coming into these conversations from different places. So by feminism, I mean a practice based on intersectional analysis of systems of oppression. It analyzes race, gender, class, ethnicity, ability, and sexual and national identities to work together to position us in complex power dynamics in relation to one another. It sees oppression as operating systematically through social institutions, like the government, the media, and the educational system, and it seeks to cultivate empowerment and agency from marginalized groups. By feminist pedagogy, I sort of build on this definition of feminism to inform teaching practices that educate the whole student. Feminist pedagogy sees students as teachers and co-creators of knowledge and the classroom space as a site of knowledge production. And self-reflection is really a central feature to feminist pedagogy as well. By oppression, I mean a system of power that subordinates some groups in order to over-empower others. It's an interrelated system of disempowerment and over-empowerment. And I also use it, of course, to refer to the painful and violent effects of oppression. Now, anti-oppression in this context will be used to refer to the process of unlearning the tools of oppression and dismantling the systems of oppression. For the purposes of flow in this webinar, I might use the term diversity classes or social justice classes interchangeably. Obviously, there are nuances to each of these terms, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this project, at least this webinar. All right. So for those of you who maybe are a little unfamiliar with mindfulness, I'm using the term to refer to the process by which we become more self-aware through particular practices. And I'm going to use the term contemplative practices to refer to the specific activities or techniques we use to become more mindful. And these practices can take a variety of forms. They can be secular in nature. A further discussion of this is beyond the scope of this webinar, but I think that it's a ripe discussion for diversity classrooms to talk about some of the traditions that some of these mindfulness practices come from and the complications or nuances of using them in classrooms. I think that that is worth discussion and is really relevant to diversity classrooms. But I'm going to move on to the just a really brief definition of mindful learning. Just for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with that conversation, Ellen Langer was one of the early people doing mindful learning conversations, and she really gives it 5 characteristics, many of which I think are really relevant to anti-oppression classrooms. Openness to novelty, and in that situation I would say, new ideas that are different from one's own, paradigm shifts, all of which are relevant in anti-oppression classrooms. An alertness to distinction and a sensitivity to different contexts. When we're in anti-oppression classrooms, we talk about how things have different meanings for different people. It means something different if an LGBT person uses the word fag and if than if a straight person uses that same word. And while I personally disagree with the use of the word at all, the complexity of context and identity is worth a conversation. So distinction and different contexts, why context shapes meaning at times. An explicit, if not an implicit, if not explicit awareness of multiple perspectives, intersectionality of identities, how our race, class, gender, sexual identity, national identity, ability, all of these things intersect to create a perspective that is a part of a larger picture. And historically, some of these perspectives have been excluded from educational systems, government systems, etc. And so helping students kind of understand how their perspective matters, but it's only part of the picture, and we need to piece all of the perspectives in relation to one another. And then an orientation to the present. This is a real gift, I think, that mindfulness brings to anti-oppression classrooms, because it helps us really begin to be aware of what's happening when we have these discussions and when we really start to explore these issues. The Center for Contemplative Mind and Society has this great visual of contemplative practices tree, which kind of outlines the range of practices that can be included within the idea of mindfulness practices. And it can be yoga and meditation and qigong. It could also be gardening, it could be walking, it could be quieting the mind or breathing, pranayama, or other kinds of centeredness. There's all kinds of things that we can do, some of which we may already do, but not really with a mindful bent in, in the back of our head. So we might really be able to draw on a range of pedagogical practices to bring mindfulness into anti-oppression pedagogy. But before we go there, let's ask the question, why integrate mindfulness? What does it offer to anti-oppression pedagogy? And here, I think it's really important to acknowledge that oppression doesn't operate on a merely intellectual level. Even though higher education tends to privilege the rational and the intellectual, oppression is painful and it's embodied. It's held in our bodies, it's held in our hearts, it's held in our spirits and our minds. And the deep narratives that we learn in society, whatever our identities are also deeply embedded generally in our sense of self. And so if we stay at the level of the conceptual, we're not actually getting to the deep roots of oppression. I also think, as I'm sure any of you know who have taught in these classrooms, that conversations about oppression are hard if they're real. You know, if they're just surface, then they're not as difficult. But as soon as you start really grappling with the messy issues, they're difficult, they're painful. Issues come up. People have conflicts in the classroom. People experience emotional reactions, and that's part of the work of what we have to do. It's not something to be shied away from. I think it's what has to happen. But I think we need to give students tools to really be able to sit with that and hold those reactions with compassion and understand them as inevitable byproducts to living in an oppressive society. They happen in part because students in any given classroom will be coming from a variety of positionalities. Their identities will be different. Their lived experiences, their politics will be different. Their sense of self may be different, and that will affect how they engage these issues. And so if you have a range of those points of entry or reactions in any given classroom, then stuff's going to come up. And I think that stuff that comes up is the work, as I've said. But I think that we're lacking some tools in our tool belt that would be really, really helpful for helping us navigate those differences in compassionate and really productive ways. I also think it's really important to acknowledge that students will be at different levels of awareness in processing these issues. For some students, they may never have heard of any of these issues before, and it might just blow their mind and their sense of self out of the water. And that could feel really disempowering, really unsettling. For other students, they may have grown up around activists. They may have, gone to marches with their parents and really sort of worked through a lot of these issues as a part of their sense of self. And so they may be really, really savvy. Still probably, I think we all have more work to do no matter how long we've been learning about these issues, but they will be at a very different place with that conversation in a classroom than will the first student. And I think that part of why these conversations get hard in any kind of classroom is also because of that sort of different levels of engagement, different levels of self-awareness that mindfulness can really help us begin to navigate in productive ways, not just as teachers, but also as students. Because what we ask students to do is apply this learning to their own lives, right? We ask them to look at current events or the movies they watch or the language they use with their friends and to really look for these systems of oppression and these patterns. But I wonder if we do enough to teach them to understand what they are experiencing, literally embodied in an embodied way, in an emotional way. Do we teach them how to understand why they might be having those reactions, why their heartbeat starts to race when somebody says something that seems to invalidate their sense of self, why they suddenly feel like they need to take up less space because they feel threatened, or more space because that's how they are trying to sort of resist a form of repression? Do we teach them to understand the connection between those embodied reactions and the concepts we're studying, and why other people sitting across the classroom from them might have different responses? Mindfulness gives them a language for understanding their responses in both an intellectual and an embodied way. Now, it doesn't do it alone. That's why I think the merging of anti-oppression and mindfulness really has to happen, because we need the anti-oppression analysis and language, but I think it can get deepened through mindfulness. And then mindfulness also really gives them the tools for processing and sitting with those reactions, which I think is a really important survival mechanism for marginalized groups, and also for anybody who wants to do this work as allies. I think having those tools becomes a way to stay in the conversation in productive ways and to really take care of ourselves and build resilience. Because it teaches us compassion and empathy for ourselves and for others. I see mindfulness as an embodied self-reflection. So as a feminist teacher, I've been teaching self-reflection as a part of my, pedagogy for as long as I've been teaching college. It's central to what we do. But I was beginning to feel like we were missing a step, that students could feel really empowered intellectually and even politically, but still have eating disorders, still have really negative senses of self. It would seep out in surprising moments because it's way deeply buried in our sense of self, depending on our identity and our cultural location. And so mindfulness takes that self-reflection to an embodied level and really helps us, go a little bit deeper, which I think is critical to unlearning internalized oppression. I'm working on the chapter in my book on internalized oppression, and I really see it as a trauma. I see it as something that's embedded in the very cells of our being. And if we're going to unlearn internalized oppression, then I think we need some mindfulness tools to be able to do that, with compassion. I think it's really important that while we condemn oppression, we keep compassion for ourselves and for others. So there's a difference in my mind between having compassion for whatever is coming up for you in this really hard conversation and whatever is coming up for the person next to you in this really hard conversation. Have compassion for that. There's a difference between having compassion for that and condemning oppression. I think we need to do the former and the latter both. And I think that mindfulness gives us the way to do that. Well, a way, not the way. I feel like I want to merge the two, anti-oppression and mindfulness, into a productive relationship with one another, because oppression is held in our bodies, our hearts, and our minds, regardless of the identity, whether we're a quote-unquote oppressor in some moments or a quote-unquote oppressed. I think it's more complex than those easy categories, but regardless of where we are in positionality, it is held in our bodies, our hearts, and our minds. And if we only ask students to learn about oppression at a conceptual level, I think we're missing 2/3 of the journey. I don't think we can effectively unlearn oppression if we don't engage that first 2/3 of the journey. And I certainly don't think we can dismantle the systems of oppression without engaging that part. And for me, mindfulness has really brought a rich practice to my own life in doing that as a teacher and a social justice activist and a yoga teacher, but it's also brought a lot of rich pedagogical tools that I found really productive in the classroom for helping students to do that. Because it helps us cultivate the witness, which I see as a kind of meta-awareness, right? It helps us begin to really become aware of what we are experiencing in the moment, rather than just sort of lashing out in the moment, which has its place, but we can become sort of conscious of what's actually happening. It teaches us perspective, and it helps us get bigger than the experience, right? So that we can have the experience, we can honor our experience and those of others, but we're also bigger than the experience. We can bring the analytical lens and the compassionate lens to what we and others in this, I'm imagining, classroom setting are experiencing. Mindfulness teaches us a kind of detachment. And I really want to make a key distinction here between detachment and disassociation. I think disassociation is something that a lot of people feel, particularly women, maybe people who have been sexually assaulted, men, women, or trans folk, disassociation is a way to survive, and it has its place in the healing process. But ultimately, it has its limitations, and it's not what I mean when I say detachment. When I say detachment, I mean we can have our experience, our physiological, our emotional, our gut experience. We can honor that, but we can also be bigger than that, and we can make a more intentional decision about what we want to do or say or be in that moment. And we can be non-judgmental about the reaction that we're having, both ourselves and others. You know, I have a lot of young feminists who use feminism to beat themselves up, right? Like, I'm not feminist enough. So I don't think that kind of awareness is really helpful, but a kind of non-judgmental, oh, look, this is what's happening. Why is it happening? Where is it coming from? How have systems of oppression really produced that? Why would my lived experience produce this reaction and the student next to me who has a different lived experience have a different reaction? And then, what do I want to do about it? So it teaches us to accept what is in the moment, and that means accept our responses, not the oppression itself. That we still need to fight against. But I think by doing this, we can really establish a connection with others without minimizing differences of identity and experience. And we can begin to see how different people's experience and perspective shapes their actions and understandings. I mean, I think we do that conceptually, but it can be harder in the moment when people are arguing over a particular issue in the classroom, right? People might have reactions to what the student next to them said, and that does need to be engaged. But if they can be more mindful about where that response might have come from, why it's happening, then they can be a little more intentional, a little more discerning. I think discernment teaches us a kind of adaptability and lets us contextualize a response. You know, why might it be, why might someone have a response the first time they learn about, you know, compulsory heterosexuality, or the first time they hear about systematic racism? Why might they have a response, one response that moment, and quite a different response 20 years later when they're social justice activists, where they're still unlearning their own piece of the oppression system, but they have more familiarity with it and they've done some of their work. Contextualize, situate reactions. It teaches us adaptability, which I think for social justice activists are really important, and for anybody who wants to be able to have some choices, even if they're not social justice activists. If they want to be able to make more intentional choices in the moment when something happens, some form of oppression, you know, they experience some form of oppression, and they want to be able to have a range of choices about how they respond to it. They may not have choices in terms of the oppression itself, right? People can't choose not to be oppressed because the system is bigger than them. But they maybe have a range of choices about how they respond to their own response to it, and able to make a more strategic choice about how they want to engage in the moment. Because what mindfulness helps us create is what one of my yoga teachers calls the holy pause. And she talked about how, I'll just go over this really, really quickly, but she talked about how, you know, stimuli comes into our limbic system, and we maybe move into a kind of fight or flight moment. And that's a really important survival skill. We need to be able to do that in moments where we need to survive. But in other moments, that same fight or flight response is maybe a little less useful. It maybe doesn't serve us if we're not actually in a survival moment. We may be in a complex and a hard moment, but it may not be an actual fight or flight moment. And so meditation lets us create that pause to move into the prefrontal cortex, to move the stimuli into a place where rationality is employed. And I don't like to use the word rational because it has so much baggage in a feminist context, so I prefer the word intentional, right? We create that pause where we still honor our reaction, but we can become more intentional about how we want to engage it. And that is strategic, right? What will serve us in this moment? Us individually, our students individually, but also, you know, whatever our vision for social transformation is. What will actually be helpful to get us towards that more equitable environment or a more equitable space? I feel like if we don't give students tools for navigating these hard conversations, then they will either shut down and avoid the discussions, or they will lash out at each other. I'm not sure that either one is super productive in the classroom. I'm not afraid of conflict. I think that has its place. I think it needs to happen. But I think some additional tools besides the ones that we currently give would be really helpful. I think, as I said, mindfulness is just another really rich tool in the tool belt for us to draw on. And it's a skill that can be learned and a practice that builds resilience. I think resilience is super important as a life skill for our students who are survivors of any kind of internalized oppression or oppression as a whole from external sources. I think resilience is a life skill, and mindfulness brings an added element to what we offer in anti-oppression classrooms. And I think it's really critical for authentic and compassionate dialogue about oppression. I'm really not interested in conversations about oppression that stay on a surface and polite level. I think they need to be real and they need to be authentic, but they also need to be compassionate. At least I feel like they need to be. I need to be able to bring compassion to the dialogue, and the only way I can do that is through mindfulness as it merges with anti-oppression pedagogy. I want to acknowledge that it's not going to happen in a semester. We know that. Systems of oppression don't get dismantled that quickly. Students don't unlearn narratives they've learned for a long time that quickly. But we plant the seeds. And I think I have found that students are often really hungry for the seeds of mindfulness, and they end up asking for it later in the semester. And so I think that those seeds are really rich. So at this point, I want to stop and have us do a merge, transition into a short practice, and then we'll transition into the second part of the webinar. I do want to say before I do that, because of time constraints, I'm not going to go into a lot of specifics about how to use mindfulness in the classroom. That is, what particular practices might be useful. I will in my book, but you might really want to check out Contemplative Practices in Higher Education, the new book by Daniel Barbizad and Mirabai Bush. Really helpful outline of a lot of different practices that could be integrated. And again, I hope this conversation continues where we can have more detailed discussions about some of that. All right, so we probably have a lot of thoughts spinning through our head, so let's come back to our bodies. We can take a good seat, maybe allow our sit bones to root us to our chair or wherever it is we are, extend up through our torso. We're going to do a samana breath, which in yoga traditions is a breath in the abdomen that really is about centering and balancing. So really kind of drawing our energy into our center in order to balance. And I think balance is a really critical step in having these conversations about oppression. So please begin with your eyes closed. Visualize the universe, stars, galaxies, planets, suns all around you. As you inhale, draw all of these forces through the top of your head, down into the spine, and into your navel center. Hold your breath briefly and feel a fire burning up, transforming itself into a powerful blaze, a powerful fire. As you exhale, let all the forces spread into the tissues of your body and the layers of your mind and your heart. With the next inhale, draw energy in from the environment around you, your community, the physical, natural environment, things that strengthen you. Draw that energy down into your navel center. And as you exhale, radiate that energy out into your fingertips, into your heart and your mind. Inhale, drawing energy all the way down into your navel. hold your breath briefly and feel a fire transforming into a powerful blaze. And then radiate that energy back out. And keep doing that 4 or 5 more times at your own pace. Inhale, drawing energy from the sources that support you all down into your navel center, your core. Hold your breath briefly and feel a transformational fire burning, and then radiate that light, that energy out into your entire being. And last time. And now rest and visualize that energy that you just generated as a spiral of multicolored energy and light that's anchored at your navel and becoming increasingly concentrated. So I imagine sort of the aurora borealis getting increasingly luminous and stable and centered. Visualize this ever concentrated spiral of colored light at the navel, spreading its power through your whole being. So for the next couple minutes, imagine that vortex of energy in your navel becoming luminous and increasingly concentrated until it is a point of stability and centeredness from which you radiate power into your entire being. Thank you for joining me in that practice. It's a short one, and there are so many other valuable practices that we could use if we have more time that I think are relevant to anti-oppression classrooms. But thank you for taking a moment to center and balance. So what happens when we integrate mindfulness into the classroom, when we bring these kinds of practices into an academic space? I think it's really important to remember that our students have really complex lives, much of which we don't know about as staff or professors. They may tell us some of the complexities, they may not, but they are always bringing that complexity into the classroom. And the classroom is not, it's an institutional space. It is not safe for many people. I firmly believe in safe space and do my best to create it, but I don't know that I really believe it exists. I think spaces can turn unsafe in a moment. And mindfulness asks people to be vulnerable. It asks people to be present and to allow their whatever's happening to be present. And that can be really hard to do. That level of self-reflection can be really hard to do when you feel really unsafe. In fact, I think it's impossible to do if you feel really unsafe. It can be a really important tool to begin to feel safe. I think that's really important. It can be a tool that can get us to a place of cultivating a sense of internal safety even in externally challenging environments. But that takes a lot of skill and practice, and in my experience, many students are not that well versed with these practices. And students come in at very different levels of identity development and self-understanding. That also is an issue that we need to keep on the table. And finally, I want to really underscore the fact that faculty deal with these issues too. We get our buttons pushed. You know, we bring our identities into the classrooms too. And that means we need to do our own work. We know that as anti-oppression teachers. You can't teach about oppression without doing your own anti-oppression work. Similarly, I don't think you can really teach mindfulness without doing your own mindfulness work. It doesn't feel authentic to the students. You can't model it if you're not doing it. And also, I think we just need to, be clear that we have these issues come up for ourselves too. And mindfulness offers us tools, but also allows us tools for modeling for our students how we handle those issues in productive ways. So with that said, let's look at a scenario. And we're running short on time, and so I'm only going to share one scenario. The article that I just published through the Journal of Contemplative Inquiry, it's called Contemplating the Effects of Oppression. It goes over, I think, 4 different scenarios of different students. So please check that out. It's available off my website. It's also available off the website of the Journal of Contemplative Inquiry. And the scenarios are really composites of students that I've worked with over the series of years. They're not really one student's experience. They're a composite, and they're designed to really kind of bring out aspects of a student's experience of mindfulness that we might not be aware of as someone who's leading the practice, at the front of the room. Okay? And so you can get the whole gist of it. I'm going to go ahead and read the scenario. Jennifer is an Asian American woman who was recently sexually assaulted by a male student with whom she went out on a date her second week on campus. She has not told anyone about it because she feels so ashamed. No one notices that she has gotten more withdrawn and quiet since the event because few people on campus knew her before the incident. She is simply shut down, keeping her eyes downcast and wearing baggy clothing. In the 7th week of her sociology class, the teacher begins to lead them through a body scan, telling them that this meditation practice can be a helpful way of handling the stress of the upcoming midterms. The professor turns out the lights, which makes Jennifer suddenly feel afraid. But she decides to give it a try, figuring she could use some help with stress. As she listens to the professor's voice and begins to drop into her body, the fear gets stronger. Her heart rate increases, she begins fidgeting, and her body tenses up. By the time the professor has moved to the hip and pelvic area, Jennifer wants to crawl out of her skin. His voice grates on her and she wants to run from the room. When the exercise is over, she is shaking. And though the professor says goodbye to her when she leaves, he doesn't notice that she shies away from him and doesn't come to class the next day. She spends the rest of the day in her darkened dorm room. So this is just one of many complex responses a student might have to a practice that's designed to be really empowering, really grounding, really centering. That's what body scans and other forms of contemplative practices do. But students are coming to these practices with different experiences and different embodied experience. In this case, a recent sexual assault has probably meant that she's very disembodied. And for her, at this stage in her healing process, she's probably not ready to become embodied. And so it's a very risky experience for her. It's amazing that she even sinks into it and tries, but then it brings up things for her that as professors we may not know anything about. I don't think that these various scenarios mean that we shouldn't use these practices in the classroom. In fact, I think they make it all the more important to use these practices. Certainly, eating disorders clinics, sexual assault survivor organizations, they're bringing mindfulness in as part of the healing process. So they're really valuable tools. But in the classroom, that's not our environment necessarily, and we don't know all of those things about our students. They may not tell us the responses that they have. They may not even have the self-awareness to be able to articulate why it's happening, especially if they're new to mindfulness itself. And so I think that as professors, regardless of the classroom that we're in, we need to be able to support students who will have a variety of responses to these exercises. And so the question is, how do we do that? In women's studies classrooms, I have often said, we give students a language for talking about things, such as, for instance, sexual assault. Those students are in every other class on campus. They may just not be talking about their experiences there, but they bring their experiences into those rooms. And so offering the language becomes really valuable. But when we ask students to become embodied, to do a meditation, to do a yoga practice, to do a walking meditation, to do even a mindful eating exercise, all of which are well-intentioned, depending on the person's lived experience, they could be really fraught. And so we as professors we're not counselors, that's not our job, but we do need to be responsible in how we're bringing these into the classroom, and we need to support our students. So I'm going to just offer a couple tips that I think are beginning steps. Again, I think this is a much longer conversation, but some beginning steps for integrating mindfulness into anti-oppression pedagogy. And the first is to assume that someone in the room has suffered from trauma. I think it's inevitable. 1 in 4 college students have suffered or sexual assault, right? That means in any given group, the likelihood is pretty strong. And if we consider internalized oppression as a kind of trauma, or if we consider the number of veterans who are coming back struggling with PTSD, the likelihood is that someone in the room has suffered from something that could be triggered by some of our mindfulness practices. And I just go in assuming that that might happen and trying to prepare students for that. And one of the ways I prepare students for these possible reactions is just giving them a language for it. Letting them know that some of these practices can really bring up tough things. I do that whenever I talk about sexual assault in my classroom as a unit. I say, we need to be mindful that many of these issues touch us deeply, and be sensitive about how it's affecting us and be mindful about how we use language. But I think it's even more important, or just as important, when we do mindfulness. Prepare them for these possible reactions. Offer the option of opting out. It is not necessarily the best thing for a student to engage in some of these practices, and we as professors aren't always the best judge of it. Jennifer might not want to tell her professor that she's just been sexually assaulted, and yet she might not want to engage in a body scan either. A meditation that asks her to sink into her body. And so we need to trust the student to be able to, on some level, make that decision for themselves, and give them options. So one thing that I try to do is warn them ahead of time that these things are going to happen. So next class we're going to do a yoga class, or next class we're going to do a mindful eating class. So I don't drop it on them unannounced. And then the student has time to come to their own decision about whether they want to attend that portion of class and or contact me. And if a student wants to contact me and says, look, I can't come to that class because of whatever, then, I don't want them missing class, but I'm also aware of the fraught nature of some of these ideas, and so I offer them alternatives, other assignments they can do, other ways of engaging that is safe and comfortable for them. In the moment, let's say you do decide that you want to do a mindfulness practice and on the spur of the moment. Maybe just give them other alternatives. Invite someone, if they don't want to do the body scan, to simply sit quietly, or maybe repeat silently an affirmation to themselves, like a sentence, I am worthy, all beings are worthy of compassion, something that can allow their mind to focus. But so they get some of the same mindfulness benefits, but they're able to not engage in the other practice. And students don't necessarily want to make a big scene and get up and walk out. If you're like, you don't have to engage in this, you're welcome to leave for the next 15 minutes, that makes them a spectacle. And students often don't want to do that. So offering them a really discreet alternative is really valuable. Provide them with support services. Connect them to the Counseling Center, the Student Affairs, the Women's Center, the Multicultural Resource Center, the LGBT Resource Center. Let them know that there are campus resources here, and that while you are not a counselor as a professor, you can be the bridge. And then just hold the space with compassion, right? Our students' buttons might get pushed by some of these anti-oppression conversations and discussions, but if we can hold the space for that and not engage at a level of reactivity as professors, then we can hold the space with compassion and offer them more productive suggestions for how to respond. And I'm going to close with this quote by Eve Ensler. You can't dominate people without separating them from each other and from themselves. The more people get plugged back into their bodies, each other, the more impossible it will be for us to be dominated and occupied. That's really the work right now. Thank you for participating in this webinar. And now let's take a few moments to engage some questions.
There are a lot of fantastic questions.
Yeah. And I want to also reiterate that I really want to engage these questions after the fact, so I'll be looking over them and maybe we can communicate directly, through email or something. But one of the questions is from Sydney Beret is, how do you suggest working through reactive emotions like anger? I think reactive emotions are inevitable in any kind of real conversations about anti-oppression, and I think we do a disservice to our students if we don't offer them ways of dealing with them. And that's part of the area where I felt like my teaching really needed an additional set of tools, which is why I turned to mindfulness. I think it starts by having people get used to practicing mindfulness in less intense moments, because you can't draw on mindfulness when you're really worked up if you haven't already practiced it. So beginning to bring it in the classroom on a regular basis so that students understand what it means to turn inward, so that they can become more aware of what they're experiencing, and maybe begin to talk about at some point, what does fear feel like in you? What does anger feel like in you? What does shame feel like in you? These are all kinds of things that might come up in these kinds of conversations. And then when you notice these things coming up and a student getting, sort of really sinking into shame or having some sort of response such as anger, then you can maybe invite students to just sink in, maybe take a moment of quiet, not to sort of avoid whatever is happening, but to say, I can see that these are intense conversations, and let's just take a moment to connect with what's going on for each of us individually. And just let them become familiar with that as a practice, because if they get used to doing it in your classroom, they'll turn to it, if it works for them, they'll turn to it in other moments outside of the classroom. And then, once they become familiar with that, oh, this is what anger feels like for me, and oh, I'm feeling anger right now, then they can begin to say, well, how do I want to respond to that in this moment, in this classroom? What do I want to say? How do I want to engage this? Another question here is there a way that mindfulness practice can help those who experience trauma other than opting out? Are there practices that are less re-traumatizing? Yes, I think that there definitely are. There are some practices are way more risky than others. As a yoga teacher, there's a great book by David Emerson on yoga and trauma, and it's out of the Trauma Center in Boston, and they do a lot of work with survivors of genocide, as well as PTSD and sexual assault surviving. And so he's got a whole set of guidelines for how you would teach yoga to this group in a way that might be different from what you might experience in a yoga studio or a gym to the general public. And it's things like you never touch. Even, in most studios they'll tell you ask permission first, but in this environment it's sort of like never touch, which in an academic classroom also makes some sense. Things like, don't turn the lights out. Stay in a pretty stable space. Don't move all the way around, all around the room, especially if you ask them to have their eyes closed. Certain poses aren't comfortable for students who have been through trauma, and so either avoid those poses or give them options. Options besides just opting out, but giving them a range of options, like I'm inviting you to do a body scan in this classroom, but here is a journaling exercise you could do as well if you would prefer that. Giving them options lets them be empowered because they have choices within, some constraints, obviously, of an academic classroom, but they have choices. And that itself can be really healing. Let's see. I'm looking. I think we have time for one or two more questions, Jen.
Yeah, we have time for just one more question.
Okay. Gosh, these are such good questions. Let's see. Have you used contemplative exercises to frame an entire semester? Something that unites both the specific context that you are teaching and a particular practice. Well, I've used these practices in a class that I teach called Gender in the Body. I felt like feminism we have so many great conversations about the body, right? So much great material. But I often still feel like the actual embodiment for our students, empowered embodiment, was kind of missing. And so I created a class called Gender in the Body that would bring in these issues, conceptually, intellectually, but would also have a series of embodiment practices. That's getting honed over the years. I'm getting more well-versed in how I do it as my sort of theory of how these two come together become a little clearer. But I think starting with something really simple like breathing exercises or a few moments of meditation, or maybe walking, somewhere on campus, something that's not super necessarily risky and not super loaded or fraught for at least most people, would be the beginning. And then sort of going into more longer practices, more deeper embodied practices, where you then bring, I guess the last thing I'll say, because I know we're running out of time, is that I think talking about the complexities is valuable. So talking to students about that doesn't work because you don't like to sit still. Well, that's okay. There are other practices that work for you. Or this came up for you. Okay, well, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It means it's an insight for yourself. Or even the issue of cultural co-optation with some of these practices. Anti-oppression classrooms are precisely the place to have those conversations. You don't have to throw a tool out simply because it's fraught. You have conversations about the complexity, and then you make intentional decisions about how you want to engage them. And those are the skills that I really want our students to learn. And with that, thank you so much. I'm really going to take a look at these questions, and I hope that we can engage further. And thank you, Jen, for your help.
Thank you so much, Beth, for sharing your work with the community, and thanks everyone for joining us and also for your patience through our glitches. I just wanted to remind everyone that the webinar has been recorded and it will be available on the website soon if you'd like to share it with colleagues. We will also make Beth's PowerPoint available as well, so if you missed anything during the webinar, you can catch up then. Also, if you'd like to share your work with our community, our next ACMHE conference will be held October 10th through 12th, 2014 at the University of Washington in Seattle. We're accepting presentation poster proposals until June 30th. You may register or submit a proposal online at acmheconference.org. Thank you for listening.